If you've been around the channel for a while, you probably know that I am not an optimizer, mostly just because I truly do not have the patience for it. That said, on a conceptual level, I do appreciate the puzzle that it creates, trying to find the things that work together in just the right way to achieve your desired result. It's really cool. And one of the things that I've always wanted to try to do was to figure out what the theoretical maximum damage output you could get from a single hit in the game is with a melee weapon. I don't really know why this appeals to me so much, it just sort of does. Anyway, that's what we are going to do today, because with the addition of circle casting to the game, things get pretty damn silly. So before we get too deep, there are a few ground rules that I've set for myself. Firstly, all content must be from 2024 and later, and I don't just mean content that hasn't been updated that is still technically allowed in 2024. What I mean is that anything that I choose must come from any of the 3 2024 core rulebooks: Heroes or Adventures in Faerun, Astarian's Book of Hungers, Netherose Fall, Lorwyn First Light, or Eberron Forge of the Artificer. And my second rule is that I can only read any of the manuals or tomes just one time. Otherwise, all other game rules would apply. So with the ground rules out of the way, let's figure out how I did. Also, I have stared at this for days now and had a few other people look over the work. As far as I can tell, it's all 100% legit. But if I did make a mistake, or if you have some ideas for how to deal even more to an enemy, let me know. Before we continue, I do just want to thank all of you so much for all the support recently. I recently crossed the 26,000 subscriber milestone, which is truly incredible. So if you'd like to support me, subscribing to the channel and clicking the like button while you're there help way more than you might realize. Thank you so much. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time on the actual build itself and the individual features because it won't matter all that much. I will be highlighting the important things as they come up, and I'll do my best to explain everything as well as I can, and I'll also mention some of my other considerations that I made along the way. For our ability scores, we're going with point buy. Literally, the only 2 ability scores that matter here are Charisma and Strength. So we're going to drop a 15 in both and just distribute the rest of them however you want. For our species, we'll be opting for Goliath, specifically with the Fire Giant ancestry because of the Fire's Burn feature, which allows us, when we hit with an attack roll and deal damage, to deal an extra 1d10 fire damage to the target. For our background, we just need to pick something that buffs Charisma and Strength, and Entertainer does both of those, so we're going to drop a +2 in Charisma, giving us a total of 17, and a +1 in Strength, giving us a total of 16. Our origin feat does not matter at all for the purposes of this build. Now, for the classes. You can probably reasonably guess where this is going, so for level 1, we're just going to hop straight into Paladin. This will give us a number of different things, but the 3 most important are a 1d10 hit die, I promise that does actually matter, proficiency in all martial weapons, and the spellcasting feature. As a level 1 Paladin, we can only prepare 2 spells. This is not a problem. The only Paladin spells we need are Divine Favor and Divine Smite, both of which are first level spells. With Divine Favor, we can, as a bonus action, apply a buff to our weapon that adds an additional 1d4 radiant damage to a hit, with the buff lasting for 1 minute. And Divine Smite allows us, as a bonus action, after we hit a creature, to deal an additional 2d8 radiant damage to the target, with the damage also increasing by 1d8 if we hit a fiend or undead. Also, when upcast, the damage is increased by 1d8 for each level above first. And honestly, that's it. That is all that we need from Paladin. The remainder of our 19 levels will actually all be going into Bard. Now, I had multiple versions of this as I was conceptualizing the build. Some involved levels in Rogue for some sneak attack damage, some involved getting levels in Ranger for Hunter's Mark, and even Warlock for Hex, and even some Barbarian levels for their hit die. Again, I'll explain that later. Ultimately, what ended up working out the best, for reasons that I will get to shortly, ended up being just going Paladin 1, Bard 19. At Bard 4, we get our first feat option. That's right, we don't even opt for a subclass because it truly does not matter. I suppose that you would most likely want to go Valor Bard if you were actually going to do this for a one-shot or something, but for the purposes of this experiment, it makes absolutely no difference what you pick. So, for our first feat, we are going to be selecting Great Weapon Master. This allows us, when we hit a creature with a weapon that has the heavy property as part of the attack action, to deal an amount of extra damage equal to our proficiency bonus, which will be +6. With our level 1 Paladin, we gain proficiency with all martial weapons, so we will be using a martial weapon that does have the heavy property, but I'll explain a bit more about that later. This feat also buffs our strength score, so that's neat. Next, at Bard 8, we get our next feat choice, and we're going to pick Fey Touched. Fey Touched allows us to select any level 1 enchantment or divination spell. Remember how I mentioned Hunter's Mark earlier and potentially taking some levels in Ranger? Yeah, never mind that. This is how we're going to get the spell. Fortunately, Hunter's Mark is a divination spell, so we'll grab that, and it also bumps our charisma by +1, making it a total of 18 for now. At Bard 12, we get our next feat, and we're going to pick up the Spellfire Adept feature from the Heroes of Faerun book. With it, not only can we boost our Charisma modifier by +1 to a total of 19 now, but we also get the Fueled Spellfire subfeature, which allows us once per turn when a spell that we cast deals radiant damage, we can expend up to 2 hit dice. We roll them and then add the total to the damage for the spell. You can probably figure out where this is going, but in case you don't, Divine Smite, famously, deals radiant damage. With this, we can expend up to 2 of our hit dice to add bonus damage to the spell when we cast it. This is also why I was trying to squeeze in some Barbarian levels for that sweet D12 hit die, but since we can't, we'll use our only D10 hit die from Paladin, and then one of our D8s from our Bard hit dice. For our next feat at level 16, we're taking Charger. I'll admit, this one is pretty boring. There's no special or particularly spicy reason to pick it at all, other than the fact that provided we move more than 10 feet before hitting a target with an attack, we get to deal an extra 1d8 bludgeoning damage. Cool. It's one of the few feats that just enables a straight up damage buff to an attack roll. And finally, at level 19, we get an Epic Boon. Now, I'm not actually going to reveal what the Epic Boon is quite yet. First, I'll explain our spell selection and how everything is going to work in combat, and then I'll reveal which boon we're going to take, because not only is it spicy as hell, but it might be a little bit controversial. For our Bard spells, we're going to be picking up True Strike and Fount of Moonlight, and from Magical Secrets, we're going to grab Conjure Minor Elementals. In case you're unfamiliar, True Strike has massively changed in 2024. Now, the spell does a few different things. Firstly, it allows us to change the damage type of our weapon to be radiant damage, and second, it allows us to use our spellcasting ability modifier for attack and damage rolls instead of strength or dexterity. For us, this is Charisma. I should probably mention that our Mystery Epic Boon did also bring our Charisma to 20, and we are now going to read one of the Tomes of Leadership to bring that up to a 22, so our Charisma modifier will be a +6. Finally, True Strike also scales with our total class level, and at 17, it's dealing an additional 3d6 radiant damage to a hit. Fount of Moonlight is a 4th level spell available to bards, and while it does do a few things, the most important one for us is that for the entirety of its 10-minute duration, our melee attacks also deal an additional 2d6 radiant damage on a hit. And finally, Conjure Minor Elementals, the GOAT. Obviously, it's nowhere near as busted as it was before the errata that addressed the ridiculous scaling, but it's still going to be doing a ton of work for us here. It's a 4th level spell available to druids and wizards, and this is why we are grabbing it with Magical Secrets, because it's not inherently on our bard list. What it does is create this 15-foot emanation that surrounds us, and then when we hit a creature that is within that emanation, they take an extra 2d8 damage, which can be either acid, cold, fire, lightning, or thunder. Unfortunately, we don't have radiant as an option here, but that's okay. We're going to go with fire because we're already dealing some fire damage with our Goliath background. Most importantly though, the spell scales with upcasting, dealing an additional 1d8 per level above 4th. And oh yeah, we are going to be upcasting this. Now, careful viewers will note that both Fount of Moonlight and Conjure Minor Elementals are concentration spells that also have a range of self, meaning that we don't have a way for someone else to cast them on us. Normally, this would be a problem and make it a total non-starter, but thanks to the Heroes of Faerun book and the new circle casting mechanic, we can totally pull this off. I have multiple videos now going over all of the intricacies of circle casting, so check them out if you need to know more, but the Cole's notes are essentially that if we cast a spell, any of our party members that also have the spellcasting or pact magic feature can opt to circle cast the spell with us and empower it in some way. In doing this, they become known as secondary casters. There are 6 options to choose from when we circle cast, but the only one that matters for our purposes is distribute. With distribute, whenever we cast a spell that requires concentration, we can distribute the mental load of the spell among any number of the secondary casters. Then, as long as at least one of the casters that contributed to the casting of the spell maintains concentration on it, the spell's effect remains active. What this functionally means is that as long as at least one of our allies with the spellcasting or pact magic feature acts as a secondary caster for the spell, once it's been cast, we can just drop concentration on the spell and have them maintain concentration on it for us. This allows us to double up and cast multiple concentration spells on ourselves at the same time, something that otherwise would not be possible. This is how we will cast both Fount of Moonlight and Conjure Minor Elementals on ourselves. The final bit of information that we need is our weapon. For that, I've chosen the Holy Avenger. In 2024, this can take the form of any simple or martial melee weapon. I've picked a Great Axe because D12s are the best dice, and it also has the Heavy property which satisfies the requirement for our Great Weapon Master feat to deal a bonus damage. Holy Avenger also requires attunement by a Paladin, so it's a good thing that we did take 1 level in the class. The real reason we picked it though is because not only is it giving us a +3 to our attack and damage rolls, but when we hit a fiend or undead, it also deals an additional 2d10 radiant damage. Spoilers, we will be hitting a fiend or undead. Also, the base damage of the weapon does deal slashing by default, but because of True Strike, we are going to be converting it to radiant. Okay, so that's everything covered except for the boon, which I promise I'm getting there. How does this actually play out? It's needlessly complicated. Here's how it works. Right before combat begins, we will cast Divine Favor on ourselves, adding 1d4 radiant damage on every hit that we make for the next minute. The spell does not require concentration in 2024. Then, on our first round of combat, we will cast Fount of Moonlight on ourselves at 4th level. This adds 2d6 radiant damage to our attack rolls. We will circle cast this with Distribute and pass off concentration to one of our allies. Then, on our second round of combat, we will cast Conjure Minor Elementals on ourselves at 8th level. This adds 6d6 fire damage to our attack rolls. We will also circle cast this with Distribute and pass off concentration to a different ally. Then with our bonus action we will cast Hunter's Mark on ourselves to add 1d6 force damage to our attack. Note, we can't circle cast Hunter's Mark because bonus action spells are not eligible to be circle cast. At some point during either of those two first rounds, an ally that did not contribute to the circle cast will go ahead and cast Crusader's Mantle. This allows them to shed a 30-foot emanation whereby attacks made by them or their allies deal an additional 1d4 radiant damage. Also, very conveniently, one of our allies will also have spent the previous 24 hours casting the Hallow spell, or maybe the cleric will use Divine Intervention to action cast it and select the vulnerability option, and they will choose to make our enemy vulnerable to radiant damage. Now, with all the setup done, which surprisingly only takes 2 rounds, it's time for the attack. We aren't just going to be hitting any random enemy though. In order to benefit from the bonus damage from both Divine Smite and Holy Avenger, we need to be hitting a Fiend or Undead. Fortunately for us, there is exactly one Fiend or Undead that meets our criteria of not being resistant to fire or radiant damage, but also having a built-in vulnerability to fire damage, the Mummy Lord. With this, we can double dip on vulnerabilities, with Hallow giving vulnerability to all the radiant damage that we're going to be dealing, but also now the fire damage that we're dealing from Conjure Minor Elementals, as well as from our Goliath species. So now, for the most part, everything in this build is actually pretty solidly under our control, but there is one assumption that we will need to make: the hit. For the purposes of this discussion, we are going to assume that we are rolling a crit. Don't at me, we're doing it. The point here is to see what the hypothetical max damage is. We need to crit. Now, just for clarity, I'm going to list all of the following dice values already doubled because of the crit. I'm not just making up numbers. So now, here's what we do. When we critically hit this sad Mummy Lord, we will also cast True Strike, turning the base damage from our Holy Avenger into radiant damage, dealing 2d12 radiant. The bonus damage from Holy Avenger also adds 4d10 radiant because we hit an undead. True Strike is then also adding 66 radiant damage because we are level 17 or higher. We are then going to use our bonus action to cast Divine Smite at 9th level to add 22d8 radiant damage on top of that. Conjure Minor Elementals also adds 12d8 fire damage. We then get an additional 4d6 radiant from Fount of Moonlight, 2d4 radiant from Divine Favor, 2d6 force from Hunter's Mark, 2d10 fire from our Fire Goliath feature, and 2d8 from Charger because we will have just made sure that we move 10 feet prior to hitting. Then we also get to add our 1d10 hit die from Paladin and 1d8 hit die from Bard because of the Spellfire Depth feature. Both of these add radiant damage. While I think it's unclear if these qualify for crits on their own, they are being added to Divine Smite anyway, which did crit, so the difference is mostly inconsequential. For the purposes of this, we will assume that they do not crit on their own. Then Hallow will double all of our radiant damage, and the Mummy Lord's vulnerability to fire will double all sources of our fire damage. So what all of this gives us is the following: 2d12 plus 4d10 plus 66 plus 22d8 plus 2d6 plus 2d4 plus 12d8 plus 4d6 plus 2d10 plus 2d8 plus 1d10 plus 1d8. So now, here's the fun part. I was just gonna say, okay, for the sake of argument, because this is a thought experiment, we're just gonna assume that we roll max damage. But probably the most insane part of this whole build is why we don't need to do that. We can guarantee that we roll maximum damage on every single die roll here. Alas, it is finally time to reveal our epic boon, the Boon of Exquisite Radiance. Introduced in the Heroes of Faerun book, the boon is objectively trash tier, unless you're trying to make the world's greatest Nova build. The most relevant part of the boon is the powerful Radiance subfeature, which reads as follows. When you make a damage roll that deals radiant damage, you can instead use the highest number possible for each damage die. Once you use this benefit, you can't do so again until you finish a long rest. Did you catch it? I'll be clear, there are probably 3 potential interpretations of how this feature works. First, it's a static check. Did the attack deal radiant damage? If so, all damage dice are maximized. Second, did the attack deal radiant damage? If so, all sources of radiant damage are maximized. Third, and I think the least likely, did the attack deal radiant damage? Yes, one source of the radiant damage is maximized. Obviously, I am in camp number 1 here, but I genuinely believe that it is entirely justified. I might not be an optimizer, but I do have a law degree, so getting stupidly pedantic with text is kind of my thing. The structure of the sentence is a strict check. If radiant damage exists, all damage is doubled. It does not specify that the radiant damage is doubled, or one source of it. I'll fully admit that it is, at the very least, ambiguous though. But let me establish why I believe that all the damage dice are maxed out. I spent hours digging through the rulebooks and even asked people in my Discord server for help. There is no section that says that damage dice are not just pooled together, or that they are even separated for that matter. Even in the damage roll section in the PHB, it just says, each weapon, spell, and damaging monster ability specifies the damage that it deals. You roll the damage dice, add any modifiers, and deal the damage to your target. Nowhere does it say that the dice are separated by type or rolled individually, it just says, you deal the damage to the target. This heavily implies one massive damage die pool. Furthermore, I know people will bring up the idea of resistance. One massive pool does not prevent this. I deal 10 damage, 5 of which is fire. It's not complicated. Incidentally, this is also how I typically say damage anyway. Perhaps even more compelling though are things like the Savage Attacker Origin feat, which does actually specify that it is explicitly the weapon's damage die that gets rolled twice. And probably the smoking gun here is the Boon of Poison Mastery, which was published in the exact same book as the Boon of Exquisite Radiance. It's literally just 3 paragraphs down. And it reads as follows. Once per turn, when you roll dice to determine the poison damage a creature takes from your attack, spell, or feature, you can instead use the highest possible number for each die. So they very clearly already have the exact verbiage that they would use when they only want you to maximize the damage dice from one damage type, and it exists in this boon in the same book, and it's not in Exquisite Radiance. Also, it can be implied from the fact that the Boon of Poison Mastery can be applied every turn, while Exquisite Radiance is once per day. Since Exquisite Radiance will likely be dealing way more damage on that single hit, they limited it way more. So that's my case and I'm sticking to it. Boon of Exquisite Radiance provides us with a legitimate, albeit slightly ambiguous, way to guarantee max rolls on every single one of our damage dice. Now, if you don't buy this, that's fine too. Again, this is a thought experiment. You can just assume that for the purposes of doing this, we rolled max damage. In that case, we'd swap out the Boon of Exquisite Radiance and swap in something else and probably actually end up dealing more damage if we're assuming max damage anyway. So if you think about it that way, I'm actually lowballing our damage target because I wanted to see if it was possible to do it within the rules of the game. You're welcome. One other thing that is worth noting is that even with this potentially generous interpretation of how the boon works, I still think it's verging on underpowered. Remember, this is only available once you are level 19 and can only be used once per day. And probably more importantly, most characters are not set up to execute the way this one has. So if we take all that into consideration, I don't think that it's that big of a deal. And if someone asked me if they could do this, maximize all damage with this boon, I would 100% let them. With that, all of this adds up to our 2d12 plus 40d10 plus 66 plus 22d8 plus 2d6 plus 2d4 plus 12d8 plus 46 plus 2d10 plus 2d8 plus 1d10 plus 1d8. Then, including all of the vulnerabilities, it is a grand total of 912 damage, of which 652 is radiant, 232 is fire, 12 is force, and 16 is bludgeoning. Then we also get to add our 6 from Great Weapon Master, 6 from our charisma modifier, and the 3 from our damage bonus from our legendary weapon. This brings our absolute maximum damage on a single hit to a monstrous 927 damage. I think probably the single funniest part of this is that while on paper, this deals way more damage than any monster has hit points, but it actually would not even one-shot a Tarrasque. The Tarrasque in 2024 D&D has 697 hit points. However, it is immune to fire damage and is resistant to bludgeoning. So if we subtract those two sources from our calculation, we'd only be dealing 687 damage, leaving it alive with 10 hit points. I guess the build sucks.